Big smiles, everyone. Perfect. All right. Okay, so I think we'll get started. Thanks for everyone for coming in today. I know coming in for a guest lecture isn't always the most fun thing to do, but I'll try to keep this interesting for everyone. My name is Matthew Ross. I'm a graduate student in the Journalism and Media Communications department. Second semester. I had a little untraditional start to the program. Usually we don't start until the fall, but they asked me to start a little early, and I said, sure, why not? And yeah, Jessie asked me to come in today. I know she couldn't make it because I'm a photographer. It's something that I'm very passionate about, something I really enjoy doing. And what I really enjoy doing is wildlife photography. And that's a big reason why I'm in this department, why I'm here right now, and studying more, I guess, visual communications, visual, environmental, and science communications. And Jessie just asked if I could come in and share that with you guys a little bit. And yeah, kind of share some of my experiences in my photography, what I do, why I do it, and see if anybody here, maybe this is something that some of you guys would be interested in doing in the future as well. So here I am, Matthew Ross. You can find me at Wild in Focus. That's my handle. I'm not very social media active. I just started recently sharing my photos online again. I guess as everybody knows, social media has not been the best environment recently, but I figured I'd kind of re-engage myself a little bit. So if anybody wants to look me up and follow me, I'd really appreciate that. I have started regularly sharing my work again. And yeah, so, okay. So why do I take photos of wildlife? That's a really good question. But first, why do you guys like to take photos? Do we have any photographers in here? Okay. Anyone? Just one? Yeah? Okay. So why do you like to take photos? Okay. Great. Did somebody else back there? Was there another photographer? Did I see a hand get raised? No? Okay. So why do we take pictures, though? So outside of like personal preference, why do we go out there? Why do we use a camera? What's really the purpose of it? Eric. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, why else? I mean, there's no wrong answers here. So why else do we go out there and take photos? No? Brennan? Okay. Yeah, there you go, yeah. And I mean, we take photos to share experiences, and I think that's a really big thing. We want to tell stories. This is something that we're experiencing, and we want to capture that. Like Eric said, we're capturing a moment in time. But outside of our own enjoyment of that photograph, we want to share that with other people. And I think that's a really powerful aspect of photography, because we can just pick up a camera, we can go somewhere, and we can capture a slice of time. And now with modern technology, I mean, we can share that with anybody, right? I mean, you can just put it on your phone, put it up online, the entire world gets to see it. And I think that's really awesome. And as you guys as journalism students, that's a really powerful tool for your futures. When you guys are working, being able to get out there and share your stories. You're going to hear this because you guys are all sophomores, right? I think pretty much. So you guys are going to hear this over the next couple of years. Successful journalists, you have to have a lot of tools in your toolbox now. You can't just be a writer, you can't just be a photographer or a videographer. You want to be able to do a little bit of everything. And photography is it's a great way to share experiences with people. If you want to be a writer, to have a photo to go with it. Take a photograph, you want to be able to write and explain it, so on and so forth. So, yeah. So why do I like to take photos? I have a little quote here. I really like Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was a nature writer in the 1800s. If you haven't heard of him, highly recommend checking him out. Very inspirational. He's got a lot of great quotes. And this one, I think, really resonated well with me. To adopt the pace of nature, her secret is patience. And wildlife photography is all about patience. And photography in general, but I think especially wildlife photography. And we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the presentation. So I take pictures because I love the outdoors. We live in Colorado. What better place to be if you love the outdoors? I love wildlife. Ever since I was a little kid, I've enjoyed being around animals. I had lots of pets. I love going to the zoo. I'm from New York originally, so I grew up very urban areas, so we didn't have a lot of local wildlife. But I would go up to New York, upstate New York, New England a lot when I was a kid. Really fell in love with wildlife and animals. I love photography. I didn't do it when I was younger. I've only been doing it really for about 4.5 years. My father did photography when I was younger. It's kind of a hobby of his. Don't know why, but he decided to not teach me how to do it. But I was always kind of very curious about it. And coming back to school a few years ago and studying, before I was in the journalism department, I studied natural resource and wildlife management. I was out in the field a lot. I started bringing a camera with me, and I really started falling in love with photography. And I love to share my experiences with others. You know, just what I was just talking about. You know, taking a photo when I'm out doing something that I love doing, and then being able to share that with other people, hoping that they enjoy it, hoping that they love it, and maybe even get a little interested in what I'm doing. I want to bring the outdoors and wildlife closer to people. Again, photography is a great way to do that. Photos, videos, writing stories. You're going out there, you're experiencing it, and you're sharing it with other people. I think that's such a powerful tool, especially if you have a message, you know, that you want to relate to them. And finally, yeah, I want to educate people about wildlife and conservation. That's something very close to me. If anybody follows, you know, wildlife, nature, conservation, environmental studies at all, you know, we've seen that we've done a lot of damage to our planet over the last century, and wildlife are probably suffering the most. So I think there's a lot of great people, great scientists that are doing amazing things in conservation right now, and that's something that I'm very passionate about, sharing their stories. And I think through photography is just a great way to do that. So why communicate through photography? Because I want to make a personal connection between important issues in conservation and people to increase awareness and action. So for me, it's more than just sharing the photos and somebody saying, oh, what a cool picture. I want to hopefully inspire them to take action and do something about it. You know, being able to show them that we have so many endangered species in our country, around the world, help them maybe understand a little bit more about it, maybe care about it a little bit more. Again, I think that's just a powerful thing to do. And it's something hopefully you guys will all be doing, you know, when you become journalists, whether it's through writing, photography, video, however you decide to write and share your stories. So some of my work, Jesse asked me to share some of my photos with you guys. All the photos on these slides are mine. I've taken them over the last few years, but I thought I'd just kind of share some more of my personal favorite photos that I've taken recently. So yeah. So this is a bobcat. It's a juvenile bobcat. I actually took this photo in my backyard. Well, actually my neighbor's backyard. I live up near Horsetooth Reservoir, and we do get bobcats through there every now and then, among bears and deer and foxes and whatnot. So this one was hunting for rabbits in my neighbor's backyard. I just happened to have my camera nearby and ready to go, and wasn't too afraid of me. Let me take some really nice photos. Yeah, this is a grizzly bear or brown bear. I took this photo in May up in Grand Teton National Park. Happened to get lucky and it happened to be snowing that day, which is really awesome. It doesn't usually snow at the end of May up there, but it was really nice. This is a boar, so it's a male bear, and I got to photograph him while he was chasing a sow around, or a female bear that he was trying to mate with. So that was a lot of fun, and it was in the snow, which is really awesome. This is a great horned owl. I took this photo just a few weeks ago. I actually took it with Eric. We were doing a video project for one of our classes, and my mission was to get video of a great horned owl for the video. And I lucked out, and I actually got some really nice photos of it too. So that was pretty awesome. I was very excited about that. And I love owls. Everybody love owls? Yeah. Okay. Sweet. This is an elk. This is a bull elk. I just took this at the end of August. I don't know if anybody's ever been up to Rocky Mountain National Park to go up and watch the elk rut in September. If you haven't, and you love wildlife, it's definitely one of the best experiences you can have. That's only about 45 minutes away. The rut is their mating season, and the bulls just kind of go crazy. They bugle, so they have this really weird sound that they make to attract the females and to chase off the other males. And they'll do a lot of sparring and fighting as well. If you haven't done it, I really highly recommend it. It's a really cool thing to do. And they're right in front of you too. Like they could be 50 feet in front of you doing it. It's really cool. This is a fox. I took this photo up in Grand Teton National Park, again in May. I happened to just be driving, and I just noticed it running on the side of the road in the sagebrush, and I pulled over and took a few photos, and I think this one came out really nice. And then this is some moose. This was here in Colorado, not too far away, about an hour from Fort Collins. Happened to be just an amazing morning. It was early September, and they had just shed their velvet off their antlers. It had frosted over the night before, so the ground was covered in frost. Their backs were still covered in frost, and the leaves had just started changing, so it really made for a really nice composition and photograph. And yeah, and another owl. This is a great gray owl. They call this the ghost of the forest. They are extremely rare, especially in the United States. Really just in very northwest corner of Wyoming and Idaho and a little bit of western Montana and a little bit down the Oregon, Washington, and California coast, or inland just a little bit. I was very happy to find this owl. This is awesome. I get to spend 3 hours alone with this owl in the morning, and I took a few thousand photos of it, which is really cool. And it was just a really amazing experience. And this is actually a juvenile great gray owl as well. And yeah, so this is some examples of the photography that I do, and some of my favorites that I've taken over the last couple of years. So equipment. So does everybody have their own camera? Okay, so not many. Okay. And you guys are doing photography right now with Jesse, right? Is that kind of, okay. How have your experiences been using camera equipment so far? Are you finding it easy? Is it challenging? Yeah. Okay. 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 Anyone else are you finding it challenging to use the equipment or to learn how to use it? Or not too bad? No? I mean, everybody has a camera on their phones now, right? So we're all photographers. But if you get into photography, one of the things that you're really going to have to talk about, think about, and if you really get into it, you're going to be debating it for the rest of your lives, is does your gear matter? And most photographers, I think, will agree that gear really doesn't matter. If you know how to use a camera, if you know how to compose or frame your photos, you can take a good photo with a really bad camera. But when you start getting into more specialized photography, the gear actually does start to matter. So if you're doing wildlife photography, or if you're doing sports photography, you want fast cameras, you want long lenses like I have up here, you want a camera with a really good sensor that can shoot at a higher ISO, which the ISO is how sensitive the sensor is to the light that's reflected on it. Or if you do like landscape photography, you might want a larger sensor, a higher megapixel camera. If you do architecture, like you might even want to consider a medium format camera, because you're going to be able to take such a larger photo. It's going to get a lot more information on there. Or if you do portrait photography, you might want, it's maybe not so much about your camera, but you want a really good lens. You want really good lighting, things like that. So if it's something that you want to do professionally, then you might want to start selecting and choosing the gear that you want to use based on what you want to do. And I think what's great now is cameras are getting just so much more powerful. They're getting smaller, getting lighter. Mirrorless cameras are getting really popular right now. You don't have to use the big chunky DSLRs like I like to use. And their capabilities are just, it's amazing. The new Canon R5 that just came out is probably the most impressive camera that's ever been made. It can do video and photo, and I don't know, it can do everything. Eric, have you had any issues with it? Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, everybody wants it, so it's hard to get. But yeah, so like when you do wildlife photography, the gear does start to matter. And I just kind of broke down a couple of differences in the gear that you might want to choose if you do want to do wildlife photography or even sports photography, because really it is almost the same gear. So with professional equipment, it's more powerful. You're going to get better sensors. You're going to get a faster shutter speed. You're going to get a more sensitive sensor for lower light photography, because a lot of in wildlife and sports, photography you're doing is at low light. So you're going to want to be able to crank up your ISO and capture those low light images. They're faster, they're more accurate. Your autofocus is going to be a lot faster. The shutter speeds are going to be faster. Everything's going to be a little bit stronger. You're going to get sharper lenses. So lenses like this, they're larger. They have better glass. More light's going to get through it. It's going to be able to take a sharper, more accurate image. You have better sensors. So generally, you'll find in the professional gear, you have what's called a full frame sensor. It's a little bit larger. Where consumers, generally, it's a little smaller. It's called a crop frame sensor. A lot of the photography equipment you guys can rent or use in our department, I think it's more crop frame sensors. The only advantage to that is it actually gets you a little closer to your subject. So it does actually give you a little bit of zoom. So you don't have to have quite as big a lens like I do. Pro equipment's a little bit more reliable. It's built tougher. I can drop my gear and I don't really have to worry so much about it breaking. I wouldn't drop a consumer camera because it's, most likely it's plastic and it'll probably shatter when it hits the ground. I've dropped that big lens a couple times and it bounced and it was working right away, which is really nice. But it's also very expensive. Professional equipment, like I guess with anything, it's going to be a lot more expensive than what you'll find at, like Best Buy or Costco or something like that. Then yeah, just the consumer equipment has limited capabilities. It's generally slower. The glass quality is a little bit lower. Like I said, you have a crop frame sensor. It's less reliable, but it is more affordable. And what's really nice is Nikon, Canon, Sony, their entry-level gear and even these new mirrorless cameras that they're coming out with, the prices have been going down quite a lot, which is really nice. And then some off-brands like Sigma, they're making some really great lenses that are very affordable compared to the major brand models. So Sigma now has a telephoto lens that goes from 60 to 600 millimeters, and I think it's $2,000. But for something that can do what it does, that's actually a really good price, especially considering what I paid for this lens. Jesse asked me to talk about my workflow a little bit. Have you guys started using Photoshop or Lightroom, or what are you using in this class? Has she taught you guys a little bit? Okay. Has anybody used Photoshop or Lightroom? Yeah. Okay. Do you have a preference? You like Photoshop? Okay. What about you guys? No preference? Okay. Yeah, and that's a good description. I think it really depends what you want to do with your photos. I prefer Lightroom, to be honest. I don't like to heavily edit my photos. I think it's a little more user intuitive, but it does have limitations. I mean, Photoshop is a very powerful program and software, and you can do much more than just photography with it. I mean, you can do graphics and editing. Just the creative potential for it is pretty incredible. And it also takes a long time to learn how to do. Lightroom is very easy. You can usually just open it up, load your photos in there, and get going right away. If you've used Photoshop, it also has something called Camera Raw, which is very similar to Lightroom. And that's just kind of a built-in photo development program within Photoshop. And that's actually a nice way to kind of start learning how to use Photoshop as well. That helped me initially when I started to learn how to use it. But ultimately, I do prefer Lightroom. If you guys aren't too familiar, I was just going to kind of show you really quickly. Okay, this will close. Just why I like to use Lightroom instead of Photoshop. So yeah, here's just this box photo that I showed you earlier. I feel like the layout in Lightroom is very easy to understand, and the controls are very simple. You don't have to worry about things like layering. You don't have to worry about actually damaging your photo, because nothing you do in Lightroom is going to affect the file of the photo that you load into it. It basically makes you create like a catalog, and it creates this in the software. It's basically like an overlay. So it's like a filter almost that you're putting on top of the image to try to summarize it easily. And Lightroom will save that in your catalog, and every time you want to, it's always in there. So anytime you want to make changes, you can just load it up, you can find the photo, and you can continue editing it from there. You don't have to worry about losing the file, like the Photoshop file, misplacing it. That's the worst thing. If I've lost Photoshop files and it's terrible because you basically have to start from scratch. As long as you don't change anything in Lightroom, it saves everything that you've done, which is really nice. So you basically have your basic control panel. You have your white balance. You can adjust your temperature and tint. You have your exposure, contrast, your highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks. And then you also have your texture, clarity, dehaze, which is a very powerful tool if you use it right. And then you have your vibrance and saturation. If you want to get a little more specific, you can go into manually changing your highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. And then you can adjust your color. You have your color panel as well. So if you want to make specific color adjustments, you can do that in Lightroom. Yeah. So it does what it says it does. It's dehazing. So it's basically, it's kind of sharpening and saturating the colors a little bit because the environment isn't always perfect. If you're shooting a photograph, there might be some environmental effect. So just kind of give you an example, and I don't know if I'm explaining this best, but changing altering the dehaze, you kind of see it's really sharpening that picture. Whereas if I decrease it, it's kind of adding that haze to that photo. It's kind of adding that kind of, it's like you're looking through like fog or something. That's kind of the way I interpret it. Honestly, I don't know if that's the best way to explain it, but it can really alter your image, and if you use it well, it can really be a nice tool to incorporate in your photo development. You can sharpen your photos with Lightroom. I recommend using Photoshop for that. If you feel like your photos need sharpening work, Photoshop has a great filter for sharpening. Photoshop is also better for noise reduction, but you can do that in Lightroom as well. And then another tool that I really like, which you can do in Photoshop as well, I just think it's real easy in Lightroom, is using, I'm forgetting the word right now. Help me out here, Eric. Vignette, yes, thank you. You can add a vignette. And vignette is actually a great tool to use in your photos when you're developing them. And if you don't know what vignette is, that's actually adding, you see that kind of, I'm adding a darker or lighter ring here. And what that does is it can move the person's eye in the photo. So if you place it right, and you don't have a lot of control of placement in Lightroom, you do in Photoshop. But by darkening the edges, it actually forces your eyes to move towards your subject. So as long as you don't overdo it, you don't want it to look like you're looking through a scope, or you don't want to blow it out and have something like this. Some people like that. I think it's pretty terrible. But it can force your eye to move around in the photograph, which I think is really nice. You can draw attention to your subject. And yeah, so it's just very intuitive. It's very easy to pick up and learn. There's a lot of cool things you can do with it. I'm not going to go into full details. But what I really like about it is if I feel like a photo that I've taken needs to be edited in Photoshop, you can easily move that photograph from Lightroom to Photoshop. And all you do is, under Photo, go to Edit In. It gives you all your other software that Lightroom is connected to. And I can just click Edit in Photoshop. It'll take a second because my computer's nice and slow. But it will open this photo up in Photoshop. And from here, find it. It might be because I already had it open. Oh, there it is. And then you can do your editing here in Photoshop. So if you want to, let's say there's a leaf or a twig or something in there that you want to remove. I will occasionally use Photoshop for that. I will use Content Aware Fill. I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but it's a nice tool if you want to remove something from the photograph. Or you can use the Clone Stamp tool, which is another way to remove anything from the photograph that you don't like in there. Try to keep that to a minimum as best you can. I always say just take a better photo, and you don't have to do that. But sometimes that's unavoidable, especially in wildlife photography. You'll find that branches, twigs, things just always get in the way. It's terrible. And I do like to use a lot of filters. There's a lot of great filters in here. Like I said, you can denoise, you can add noise, you can sharpen. And then when you're done with this, which is really nice, you save the photograph. It actually saves it right back into Lightroom. So you can go back in and you can finish your editing and you can export from there. So it's a nice, easy workflow. I definitely recommend checking it out. You guys all have access to LinkedIn Learning. And there's really some great tutorials on there that show you how to use the workflow between Lightroom and Photoshop. So I definitely recommend checking that out because they're both great tools for developing your photos. Anybody have any questions about that? Everything? Eric, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and I completely agree with less is more. But as you guys are new photographers, you're probably going to find that you're editing a little bit more as you're learning your cameras, as you're learning how to use the settings and light and everything like that. I remember just a few years ago, I looked back at some of my photos, and I was, man, those were terrible photos. But and my editing was awful. But I just kept doing it. I kept taking photos. I kept editing. And now I find my editing, I do so much less editing, which is really nice. And just with any other production stuff, from video, photography, the better you do it in the field, the less you're going to have to do in post, which is always awesome. But then you're also going to figure out through practice, you're going to figure out what you like. You're going to find your style. And I think that's really the great thing about photo editing is everybody does it a little different. You know, you're going to see what you like, you're going to see what your audience likes, and you're just going to keep creating from there. And I don't think any photographer ever settles on one style. I think it's always changing. You know, mine's changed a few times in just a few years already. So, like Eric said, get on there, play with the sliders, get a little crazy with it, see what you like, see what you don't like, and I think eventually you'll find that you're really enjoying it and you're really creating some cool stuff. So, yeah. Okay, so I thought I'd share some tips and tricks that I use when I go out in the field, when I take photos. This is not everything I do. There's a lot, but these I thought would be a little helpful getting you guys started if this is something you're interested in doing. And even if you want to do like sports photography or even applies to outdoor photography in general. So some settings that I like to set my cameras to. I do use auto white balance. It just gives me one less thing to worry about when I'm out in the field. Especially with outdoor photography, the weather is always changing, especially here in Colorado. It's like every 15 minutes it's something different, right? It's sunny or it's cloudy or it's raining or it's snowing or, you know, whatever. So not having to worry about that and letting my camera handle that for me just makes my life a lot easier. If you do like to use your white balance and do the settings for wildlife, it's sunlight, cloudy, or shade. Those are the three white balance settings that you're going to use the most. But honestly, I feel like with white balance, Photoshop and Lightroom both, if you don't get it right in the field, those programs fix it so easily now for you. And it's really great. And it's just one less thing to worry about. I do recommend learning how to shoot manual. I think especially because conditions are always changing outdoors, having that ability to quickly adjust your camera to the settings you need, manual is a great thing to learn. It does take patience. It does take time. Learning, your exposure triangle and learning ISO, aperture, and shutter speed can be a little frustrating at times. You'll probably find you miss a lot of photos in the beginning. And I was very hesitant to learn it at first as well. But I'm glad I did. I'm glad I spent that time to do it. But if you're intimidated or you don't like manual, aperture or shutter priority can actually be very useful. I know a lot of photographers, especially in wildlife, because they tend to move very fast sometimes, using a shutter priority is very nice. You can set your shutter speed to exactly what you want, usually a very fast shutter speed, and just let your camera handle the rest for you outside of ISO, unless you go with an auto ISO. I don't recommend using auto ISO. I recommend changing that yourself. Or if you really like shooting at a specific aperture, you can set it to aperture priority, and again, let your camera do the work for you. But just be warned that if the wildlife is moving or your target's moving, it might end up not using a fast enough shutter speed. So that's something you want to keep in mind while you're out there. Okay. Something I learned that's really cool is match your shutter speed to at least the focal length of your lens. So let's say you have a 100 millimeter lens. You want your shutter speed to be at least 1/100th of a second. And that's for moving targets or if you're hand holding the camera. If they're stationary, if they're not really moving, you can definitely use a lower shutter speed. But that's going to give you the sharpest image possible. Or if you can go faster, obviously that's more preferable. So like that's a 600 millimeter lens. Typically I'll try to keep my shutter speed at 1/640th of a second or faster. That's just typically a rule of thumb. But like I said, if your subject, if I have an elk in front of me and it's just grazing and it's not moving and the light isn't bad, then I'll definitely stop that down and use a lower shutter speed. I'll typically come up with a good image still. But that's just a good rule of thumb to know. Definitely want to use continuous focus. You want your camera to follow your subject because they're moving away from you, they're moving towards you, they're going left or right. You don't want single focus because you're going to have to be constantly adjusting your camera. It's really nice when you can just hold down the button and just kind of let it follow the subject for you. I really recommend using back button focus. If you don't know what that is, I think you guys are used to on your shutter release. You're pressing the button down a little bit, letting the camera focus, and then you're pressing it again to release your shutter, right? So on most DSLRs, and I think on most mirrorlesses now, they have a button on the back of the camera. It's right back here. So AF on, and basically that's your focus right there. So you can press and hold that and focus your camera in your autofocus, and then you can manually release your shutter with your index finger. It makes it a lot easier. It's a lot faster. You don't have to worry about doing that kind of half press down on the shutter release. It's really nice. It's very easy to set up in your camera as well. Use continuous high shooting. That's going to be a little dial on the top. That's basically going to give you your fastest shutter speed or frames per second. When your subject's moving, you want to be able to take as many fast photos as you can. The only issue with DSLRs is they make a lot of noise because of that. It's really nice in the new mirrorless cameras. You don't have to worry about that. There's no shutter. There's no actual mechanism moving. Obviously, you want to use autofocus. And I definitely recommend shooting in RAW. And this is something you guys should probably do with all your photos, all your photography going forward. Shoot in RAW. It's going to make developing and editing your photos much better. It's much more powerful. It captures a lot more data. If you have a camera, if you want to shoot in JPEG because you want to, let's say you're a working journalist, you want to get your photos to your editor as fast as possible and you just want to shoot JPEG, I still recommend shooting both. And if you have a camera that has two cards, set one to capture RAW, set one to capture JPEG. That'll make your life a lot easier. And if you just like having that JPEG file, that's just an easy way to do it. But otherwise, I really recommend if you want to do your editing, shoot in RAW. Some helpful tips: use a tripod. This camera equipment's heavy, and you're going to want a nice stable image. Having a nice reliable tripod and one that can hold the weight of your equipment is really a necessity in this. I do some handheld camera work. My smaller lens up here, that's a handheld. That's my handheld setup. I do handhold this big setup sometimes, but you are at risk at taking a lower quality image if you're not. Especially this camera I have here. It's a high megapixel camera. It does not have high ISO capabilities. So I end up getting a lot of not sharp photos if I'm handholding. So that's also something to know about your camera when you're out there shooting as well. I recommend shooting in short bursts. Don't spray and pray. You'll see a lot of wildlife photographers. They'll do like a quick burst of like 2, 3, or 4 photos. Don't just, and these cameras are very capable of it, especially this one. So this is a 12 frame per second camera, so that's very fast. I see a lot of photographers that do that, and they'll just follow a moving subject, and they'll just at that point I just take a video. You'll get a nice video capture of them. But if you do it in quick, short bursts, that way you'll get some nice images, and you'll be able to kind of refocus yourself a little bit, especially if that target's moving. So make sure your camera is ready, set up and ready to go when you get to where you're going. Take those few extra minutes, dial in your settings, get it ready to go, because when you're doing wildlife photography, you never know what's going to happen. Be ready to go. You could be walking, you could be driving. all of a sudden it's right there in front of you. You want to be ready to capture that image. Charge your batteries and bring empty storage cards. Always a rule with any photography. Have fun and be creative. It's a really fun experience. You're outdoors, you're in nature, you're around great people that love doing this. It's a great community, wildlife photography. I've made some great friends and connections through it. And be creative. Get a little weird. Don't take the same photos that everybody's taking. It's very tempting to do that, especially if you go to a national park and there's a lot of people there. They're all huddled up in the same spot. You got 50 people taking the exact same photograph. That's great. I personally like to distance myself from those people. I'll walk down the road a little bit. I'll walk down the trail a little bit. I'll try to get my own photograph. Just try to be creative with it. And hey, if they get a better photograph than I do, that's awesome. There's always tomorrow, right? And then finally, be patient. Good things come to those who wait. I think that's a general rule in life to follow, but especially in wildlife photography, if you feel like you need a photograph right away, this might not be for you. There's definitely more days that I go out there and don't take photos than days that I do take photos. If I go on a trip, let's say to Rocky or up to Yellowstone or Grand Tetons, if I take one photo a day that I really like, I'm happy. And that's not always the case, unfortunately. I've gone up to Rocky many times, and I've come home without even taking a single photo. But I still get out there and I have fun, and it's a good time and it's a good experience. But you got to be patient, because if you're not, you might be really disappointed sometimes, and you might not want to do this. So I have to do this just because I really love wildlife and care about them. So just a few safety and ethical things when you're out there doing wildlife photography, because I want you to be safe and I want the wildlife to be safe as well. So what should you know when you go out there? So be prepared. Bring food and water. If you go outdoors, you should be doing that anyways, because you never know what might happen. Always let people know where you're going, especially if you're deciding to go into the backcountry. You don't want to go missing. You don't want search parties coming after you. That would be terrible, and it's very expensive. Carry bear spray. I'm not joking. Especially in the west slope of Colorado, or if you decide to go up to Wyoming or Montana or Alaska, there's big scary animals up there, and they might not necessarily appreciate you being out there with them all the time. So be prepared for that. And then always check the rules of the area you're visiting. Don't go into private property. The owners really don't like that. Make sure you know how the park or the natural area feels about you being out there and being close to the wildlife. They all have rules about that, so be sure to follow that. Don't feed or bait animals. That's a really big no-no in wildlife photography. The community really hates if they see somebody, especially baiting or calling wildlife. I think that's a pretty crappy thing to do. I think it stresses out the animal. It brings them way too close to people. And it also gives them, bad habits. And usually when that happens, that animal gets put down, which is really sad. Give them plenty of space. A bison or a deer or an elk might look cute and cuddly, like you might go to the farm and pet them and feed them or whatever, but they're not. They're wild animals. I'm sure everybody's seen videos of somebody getting gored by a bison up in Yellowstone. I think it happens 4 or 5 times a year. Or somebody getting attacked by a bull elk up in Estes Park because they decided to feed it a banana or something. And sadly, usually when that happens, that animal gets put down, and nobody wants to be responsible for that. If you get approached, just back off and keep a safe distance. That's something that is a little unpredictable sometimes. Don't turn your back and run. That's never a good thing to do. That just might scare them or instigate them to chase you. Just slowly back off and just keep your distance. And then finally, this is something that's kind of become a big deal in the wildlife photography community, especially in social media. Don't publicly share where you found the wildlife. Don't tag specific locations. I don't know if anybody remembers. Remember that snowy owl that was down in Denver a few years ago? Did anybody see that on the news? No? Okay. So snowy owls don't live in Colorado. And they live in Canada and Alaska. I believe in some of the more northern states. But one showed up just outside of Denver a few years ago. And it became like this media sensation, and everybody was sharing it, and there were photographs of it everywhere. And it just caused hundreds of photographers to come to this one area. And what that does is that really stresses out the animals, and it can be really dangerous to them. And it can end up, they can end up dying because of that, because they're not able to hunt, they're stressed out, it changes their behavioral patterns, and it's just not a good thing to do. So, you can tag like Colorado. Yeah. So, I mean, you can. I was actually asked recently to stop tagging even the national parks, just because some people are getting concerned just with overcrowding. It's become a big issue in Rocky Mountain National Park, where they're even cutting down the amount of people that can get into the park per day now. And also, there's hunters out there, and they want that trophy animal. And some people are even going into national parks and killing animals. It's really terrible. So I think it's even becoming a thing to not share national parks. Yeah, which is kind of sad because I love our national park system, and I want to see people, going to them and visiting them and experiencing these things. But it's, their websites are very descriptive of exactly what and where you can find their wildlife. So I think there's enough information out there that people know where they're going. Yeah. But if you have people you trust, I mean, yeah, for sure, share. Let them know where you saw it. Just as long as everybody kind of understands to not, publicly do that too much. Yeah. And then, a couple shameless plugs. Not for myself, but for the department. I talked to Greg Luff, the director of our program, and he asked me if I could just shamelessly plug our 2 photography classes. So if anybody is interested in taking more classes on photography, we have JTC 335. The prerequisite for that class is 211, so you guys will be ready to take it if it's something you want to. They offer it in the fall and the spring. I think he said there's 1 section for it scheduled right now for the spring, but it usually fills up pretty quick, so they might add another one. And it's a class that I would actually love to teach here at the university someday, so you never know. And then in the fall, they offer JTC 430, which is Advanced Documentary Photography. I took that class a few years ago with Dr. Peter Seal, who's retired now, and Greg, he teaches it currently. It's an awesome class if you really feel like you want to do photography for a living or part of your journalism professional career. You're basically going to be given photography assignments to go out, and you're going to create photo stories, which is really cool. So you're going to follow certain subjects. You can go somewhere for a day and do a series of photographs. When we did it, I followed the subject for 6 weeks, and I documented his life, him and his dog's life for 6 weeks. It was really awesome. He's a service vet who has a service dog right now, and that was a really cool experience. We got together a few times every week, and you end up writing about it as well. So it's a really cool class to take if that's something you're interested in doing. And it also looks great on your professional resume. So that's all I got. Does anybody have any questions? Anything else you'd like to know about wildlife photography? Anything you think I missed, or photography in general? Eric? Yeah, if you want to, sure. Yeah, please, guys, you got me here. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Mm-hmm. Well, I have a really big lens, so that helps. I have a big sensor on my camera, so I can crop in a little bit for sure. But the bears that I photographed are in Grand Teton National Park, the ones that I shared. So you can get a little closer to them. Especially in certain seasons of the year, they're moving around a lot. So there are some opportunities to get closer to them. They are a little more used to people. That doesn't mean go up and pet them. I definitely would not recommend that. But also the rangers there do a really great job of keeping people and the bears at a safe distance. It's kind of like this whole circus production that happens because there could be 1,000 people in one spot and 3 rangers trying to mitigate the distance between the people and the bears. And it's usually pretty good. So you do have opportunities to get some shots that you might not normally get. But even in Alaska, like you can go to Lake Clark or Katmai, and you can get very close to the bears. I mean, you can be within like 20 feet of them, and they're not going to be very threatened by you. So that's really nice. But if you're in the backcountry and that bear has never seen a person before, stay the hell away from it. Yeah, seriously. Because especially if you scare it, or if it's a sow with cubs, like that's not a good thing. Yeah. So it really depends where you go. Yeah. But there are opportunities to get closer to wildlife than you would in the wild. Yeah, for sure. Anyone else? Okay. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and there's even if you're not opposed to buying used gear, there's a lot of great websites. Even some of the bigger camera distributors, they all sell used gear. You're not going to get the newest gear used. Usually, if you spend, like this lens is $12,000. If you're going to spend $12,000 on a lens, you're going to keep that for as long as possible, unless you have like a really bad financial situation. But you can get usually the generation or two before that for really good prices. And they don't resell bad gear. They're really good about that, and they usually give a nice warranty with it as well. So this lens that I have down here on the table, that lens is probably 3 or 4 years old. I just bought it this past March, and I got it for probably about 33% of the new price, so, which is really nice. Yeah, I bought that to go to Alaska this summer to go photograph the grizzlies in Katmai, and unfortunately that got COVID canceled. So hopefully next year I'll get up there. That was a big bummer. I was hoping to have some nice grizzly photos to share with you guys today, but hopefully next year it's a little bit better. So if you guys don't have any more questions, you're free to go. If anybody would like to, before you head out, come up and check out the gear. I don't mind hanging out for a little bit and kind of showing you guys how it works.